Today on UpFront, it's now officially a pandemic. So how do you stop the spread of the coronavirus? And a year on from the massacre of Muslims in Christchurch, how big is the threat from white nationalism? The coronavirus has now hit every continent except Antarctica. On Wednesday, the World Health Organization officially declared it a pandemic. So how do we stop it? To discuss this, I'm joined by Eric Feigl-Ding, an epidemiologist and visiting scientist at Harvard, a health economist, and a senior fellow at the Federation of American Scientists. Eric, thanks for being on the show. Very rarely do we have a story like this that affects every corner of the world. All of our viewers watching UpFront on almost every continent. There's a tendency when we talk about a story this big for some people to say, you know what, you guys are overplaying it, you're overstating it, you're hyping it up. The media is exaggerating and sensationalizing. What do you say to them?
I think there's absolutely no hype to this because we've been saying it for a long time. We've been telling WHO you need to declare public health emergency over a month and a half ago. They dragged their feet for several weeks. It is just literally gone bonkers exponentially worldwide.
Some people obviously worried, and I guess we're going to see it play out now, that if you call it a pandemic, it causes more panic, it further hits markets, it may stigmatize certain people from certain countries. That was the argument. I mean, I think the WHO was even accused of exaggerating the 2009 swine flu by calling it a pandemic. Are those arguments all dead now? Or?
They're basically completely water on the bridge because it's not that there's a stigma of where you're from. A pandemic literally means it is worldwide. There's almost equal risk of infecting and endangering every single country in the world.
So you mentioned kind of the global context, worldwide. Mark Lipsitch, a Harvard University epidemiology professor, has been heavily quoted after saying, and I think he's revised his numbers down, but he originally said he thought 40 to 70% of the world's population could end up being infected with COVID-19, as it's known, in the next 12 months. Now, whatever we argue about what the fatality rate is it 1%, 2%, 3%, less than 1%? That's a huge number of people globally.
Yes.
Can you try and explain, is there any kind of comparison or analogy that we can make for that number of people to be infected?
Yeah, so that number, he clarified, is now for adults. But
Still a lot of people.
It is an incredible lot of people.
Billions.
And there are other people who basically, Angela Merkel also came out with 70% of Germany in the coming months as well. This number, it sounds large, but it is actually foreseeable if we don't do any containment and mitigation. This is if we just let the virus roam around and
Which is what the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson suggested recently.
I know, it's terrible. And there's
some traders in the US.
And the traders that said, maybe everyone should get infected over the next month so it doesn't crash the market, which is incredibly callous comments.
Because lots of people would die.
Yeah, it's called death, and 20% of people have mild. And mild means still fever and a lot of coughing, but 20% need hospitalization, and of the 20%, 5% actually need ICU.
So just for the people watching at home who maybe haven't been following this closely, maybe have listened to a certain president of the United States say thousands of people die from the flu every year.
Yeah.
Of this any different?
It is not just the flu, and anyone who says so is completely deluding themselves, endangering the public. Because half of you already have some partial immunity to the flu. This is a brand new virus. No one has immunity. There is a vaccine that works most of the time for most strains of the flu. There is no vaccine on the horizon for another year. Yeah. There's antiviral drugs, Tamiflu for the flu. There's no antiviral drugs yet that's proven for this. And it's almost 2 times or 3 times as infectious. And more importantly, this virus can spread asymptomatically, which is...
You don't know you have it.
Yes. No, you don't know you have it, and you can spread it even when you don't know you have it, when you have no symptoms. And this is completely different from the previous SARS.
So you and I could have it sitting here at this table.
Theoretically. Hopefully I'm sitting far away.
Not 6 feet, but no handshaking at the end. But here's a question to you on kind of mitigation and containment. You mentioned the global, what you do about it. You don't just let it pass through. You take steps. We're now seeing governments take varying degrees of steps.
Absolutely.
The Chinese government going pretty draconian. The US government, the president's playing golf. Not many tests have been done for quite a big population, a big country. In between, you may have South Korea, for example, which had a real problem, but is seeing, according to a lot of experts, a lot of success, bringing down numbers. People are even starting to use the word containment. When you look at the global picture, taken globally, I know it's hard to do, how well do you think the world is doing in pushing back against this?
I think the world collectively is doing a B- C+ effort. Again, there's a wide variation. I think testing in Korea is absolutely gold standard, but testing in the United States is absolutely abysmal. And finally, we have enough kits, but they basically said, we have another problem. We don't have enough reagents and chemicals to actually extract the samples so we can run the tests. And another roadblock potentially for America actually getting a handle on this virus. And many other countries are literally in the dark and taking an ostrich approach in the sand.
So when you look at the international, I've just got some numbers here from as of March the 8th. You've got South Korea with 3,500 tests per million people. Yes. You've got the UK with 350 tests per million people, pretty bad for the UK comparatively. And then you had the US with 5 tests per million people. Number one, how do you explain that discrepancy?
Yes.
Number two, what kind of knock-on effects does that have if one country's doing well but one's not?
Oh, absolutely. This is a serious problem. U.S. is 730 times below South Korea.
Why?
Because South Korea
is an advanced society,
I know,
technologically advanced, rich.
South Korea is the size of Maine, population of West Coast Pacific states. South Korea literally has put all their national resources and has central coordination. They run 15,000 tests a day.
They've got drive-through testing.
They have drive-through. America only has drive-through in one location in Seattle. And because
but a lot of drive-through restaurants.
We have drive-through restaurants. That contributes a different type of morbidity. But the issue here is the amount of testing. Without testing, you need the testing to do contact tracing, who we're in contact to, locking down, isolation. And that's why without that testing and the investigative team footwork, you cannot contain this epidemic.
When you look at whether it's Prime Minister Boris Johnson saying, oh, maybe we should let it go through, I've shaken lots of hands, or Donald Trump playing golf saying, I don't need to get tested, and my opponents are treating it's a new hoax from my opponents. Do these people potentially have blood on their hands?
I think so.
People are dying because of their negligence.
Because Boris Johnson's own health minister already came down with COVID-19. The fact that you're neglecting the testing, and U.S. had frozen testing for 2.5 weeks, that is almost 3-fold higher multiplication.
Is it,
in terms of
can we say at this point
of the epidemic,
that there are people dead who might be alive had the governments handled it differently over the last 6 weeks?
I am pretty confident that is the case.
Wow.
Because the U.S., literally, we've lost 3 cycles of multiplication. We're probably 8x higher than our epidemic should have been had we caught.
Is there time for the US, the UK, other European countries, which seem to have been slower than the Chinese, the Japanese, South Koreans, is there time to turn it around, or is it too late?
I think there are pockets in which the United States, this epidemic is not every single corner yet. Some pockets, like Seattle, has already runaway infection, potentially New York as well, and LA. But the rest of the country, there are still opportunities to prevent it from being a 50-state issue.
And how much do we need to change our lifestyles? Because in China, some scientists in the West are saying, well, the Chinese are showing the way with a kind of dictatorship model. You do need to crack down on people's civil liberties and freedoms in order to fight this. Do you share that view?
Unfortunately, I think in certain ways you have to do extreme social distancing, at least at minimum. Like all the sports games, public venues. But the draconianness of China, I don't know. Because they have the Wuhan lockdown, but they also have residential lockdowns for 750 million.
Okay, but when you say extreme social distancing, at the moment that's still voluntary, right? Please don't go to this place.
Yeah.
Please stay at home. Please, if you're sick. Where does a government step in and say, you know what, you're not allowed to do that. We won't allow you to have gatherings of more than 50 people. Are we going to get to that point, even in kind of quote-unquote free societies?
On small cities and municipalities, they already did that. For example, South by Southwest, the organizers didn't cancel. Austin declared an emergency and forcing them to cancel. We might have to do that if literally they refuse to, cancel these big events.
Are people prepared for that in the West in particular, where it's all about freedom and government doesn't tell me what to do?
I don't think people have hit the reality of how bad this will be. But when the reality hits and people realize it, it might be too late.
How bad will it be?
We're about probably 3 weeks behind potentially Italy right now in the U.S. I think it will be really bad because the U.S. is very, very poor in ratings in terms of hospital beds per capita, especially compared to many European and Asian countries. I think it will get really bad, and we will overwhelm our ICU capacity. This is why we have to flatten the curve until below the capacity of our hospitals. But without testing and containment, the epidemic will way exceed our curve, and that is when mortality will happen.
And people watching at home around the world, we hear the advice: wash your hands, keep your distance. Is there any other advice that you would give as someone who's following this closely?
Keep to the containment. I think containment is really key. Keep to the quarantines. Also avoid public spaces and try to really, really distance yourself, because washing hands is only as good as how far you are from however many contexts you are exposed to. I think at this time we have to focus on self-isolation.
We'll have to leave it there. Eric Feigl-Ding, thanks so much for joining us on UpFront. It's been a year since the deadliest mass shooting in New Zealand's history, when a white supremacist opened fire on 2 mosques in Christchurch, killing 51 Muslim worshippers and injuring dozens of others. Since then, across the world, we've seen stabbings, shootings, the firebombing of mosques and attacks on synagogues. Just recently, a racist attack killed 9 people in Hanau, Germany, and a police officer in the UK was arrested on suspicion of terror-related offences. So, how severe is the threat from white nationalist violence? And can it be stopped? Joining me now to discuss this are Cynthia Miller-Idriss, Senior Fellow at the Centre for Analysis of the Radical Right and author of the forthcoming book Hate in the Homeland, the New Breeding Grounds for Far Right Extremism, and Christian Picciolini, a former neo-Nazi who now campaigns against the far right and is author of the book Breaking Hate, Confronting the New Culture of Extremism. Thank you both for joining me on UpFront. A year ago this week, a white nationalist gunman massacred 51 Muslims in Christchurch, New Zealand, shocking the world in the process. Question to both of you, starting with you, Cynthia. How shocked were you?
I was shocked but not surprised, I think is the best way to put it. I think it wasn't at all surprising, but of course it was shocking and horrifying, and there were many dimensions of that which were different from previous kinds of attacks, like the live streaming that kind of added that awful performance to, an already horrific attack.
And Christian, you've been obviously talking about this, immersed in this world for many decades. Right. You've been sounding the alarm bell. You and I have had conversations about this in the past as well. How surprised were you? The news came out of New Zealand.
Yeah, I think like Cindy, I was also surprised but horrified, because it really did change the game. The level of violence, the number of people killed, the way it was live streamed, and the way that it had connections transnationally, how it was connected to other countries, other organizations within the white supremacist movement, I think was really shocking.
Just briefly unpack that for our viewers. In what way was it connected transnationally? Because we often talk about domestic terrorism, implying it's just local, when it's not.
Yeah, no, in fact, those alliances overseas have been forged for decades. When I was involved in the white supremacist movement in the US from 87 to 96, we were already forging those connections in places like Germany. So I think that it's ramping up. I think that these connections overseas are starting to get more violent.
Cynthia, how much does New Zealand teach us? We know we had a manifesto, we know, like a lot of other people, Anders Breivik, the killer in Norway, almost a decade ago, is a kind of inspiration to a lot of these people. We often talk, and we've talked on this show, about kind of ISIS recruits going online, connecting with recruiters or groups in Syria. How much of that can we mirror to the white nationalist or white supremacist movement?
I think in many ways they're very similar, and I think that Christchurch was a wake-up call for a lot of people around the world in governments who had been thinking of these as either kind of fringe, subcultural, problematic groups of youth, or really purely domestic problems. And it also shows how, in many ways, it does mirror some of the strategies that had been used by Islamist groups. I think people are realizing that these manifestos, the last couple of attacks in Germany, either the live streaming or the manifestos were in English for a reason, right? These were not domestic German attacks. They were, but they were designed to communicate to a larger audience and trying to speak to people outside of the country.
So, Christian, you mentioned kind of how it goes back even decades. It was even when you were in the movement, there was global links. But you, of course, joined the white nationalist movement, the neo-Nazi groups, in the late 80s, I believe, when you were 14 years old?
14.
How much has changed since, when you look at the groups today and the groups you're studying today and some of the people we're hearing about today in the US and beyond, how different is the scene today than it was in the 80s?
You know, aesthetically, it's a lot different. You know, it was important for us when we were a fringe movement to be seen, to terrorize people with the way we looked, the patches we wore, the flags we waved. But because of that law enforcement infiltration, it became existential to that movement to hide, to not be noticed, to not be seen. So I call it this kind of boots to suits movement, where they've ditched the aesthetic of what I used to look like 30 years ago and moved into looking more like, you know, the politician. David Duke was really one of the first people to do that when he got rid of the Klan robe and put on a three-piece suit of a politician and was elected
People
to the
like
House.
Richard Spencer today, who are known
Exactly.
as kind of far-right activists in the US. Cynthia, here's a question. We talk about boots to suits. Is that partly to do with law enforcement infiltration, but also how much of that is to do with the fact that the ideology, if we can call it that, has been mainstreamed in a way that, for example, you know, the ISIS ideology, just by definition, can't be mainstreamed. Whereas right now in the US, for example, you have members of the governing political party that's sitting on panels with these people, taking money from these people, saying nice things about these people. Very fine people, I seem to remember the phrase used.
We absolutely have seen a mainstreaming in two ways that I think are really important for how this has helped the public find these ideas more acceptable or just less offensive, really.
Yeah.
They are less likely to raise the alarm about it. One is that you do see mainstream politicians here and overseas echoing the same kind of anti-immigrant, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic kinds of ideas or conspiracy theories. That's really important to understand that it sort of legitimizes. But then we also see this aesthetic mainstreaming, and I think that's a big transition from when Christian first came in, that you're not seeing the kind of the shaved heads and the bomber jackets and the combat boots at the same time. These are, you know, the khakis and the polo shirts, and they look much more like the guys next door than the guys in the Aryan
One's
Brotherhood.
marching with kind of tiki torches and
right, exactly.
khakis,
and so
yeah.
that's much harder to recognize when you have that kind of aesthetic package. People think like, oh, those ideas might not be as dangerous.
And France, for example, where you have Marine Le Pen, who is now a leading candidate for the presidency, came second last time round. In the US, you have Donald Trump in the White House, who's seen, I think the New Zealand shooter called him, quote, a symbol of renewed white identity in his manifesto. Do these leaders, what I'm wondering is it that they're indifferent, that they're in denial about what's going on within their own movements, these quote-unquote, especially someone like Trump, who is a quote-unquote mainstream conservative part of the Republican Party, or is it that they're actively in cahoots with them and inciting them and seeing them as part of their base?
I think what we see across the board is that there's a legitimation of these kinds of ideas and words in ways that, you know, rally the troops, that get people, you know, to come on board, to get people to come out for votes, that get a lot of energy behind these kinds of political movements. And so I think, you know, it's hard to say to distinguish between intention and impact, but I think what's really important is to pay attention to the impact. And in a way, it matters whether there's intention there, but what matters more from my perspective is what the impact. And if these people feel legitimized and like they can just walk around in public or enact violence, that is a problem.
And Christian, do you think there is a connection? Are people in those groups actually paying attention to the words of politicians and kind of drawing inspiration from them?
Oh, I think the fear rhetoric that's being put out is affecting these people who are unstable. Listen, we are all, I imagine, stable people sitting around this table, and we are uncertain right now. We're having a hard time with this society. Imagine the people who are unstable, who are really struggling with what's happening, and the words of a politician might make them so afraid that they feel they need to walk into a mosque and murder 51 people because that's the reality.
So let me ask you a question, because we often kind of, even when we're talking about the kind of quote-unquote Islamist scene and the jihadist scene, we often do a kind of conflation between, you know, people who believe in extreme things and people who carry acts of violence. Not always the same thing.
Right.
Clearly, the guy in New Zealand, to go and murder that many people, something has to be wrong with him.
Sure.
Which I'm not going to kind of medically diagnose him, but you say unstable. Let me ask you this. Are you saying everyone who joins one of these groups can be described as unstable, or are they quote-unquote normal people who have kind of gone off the path? You yourself, as a very young man, joined this group and stayed in it and became one of the leaders of, I think, of your group. What was motivating you, can I ask?
You know, I felt abandoned by my parents growing up. My parents are Italian immigrants who came to the U.S. in the mid-'60s and had to work 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. So I grew up not knowing why they weren't around and not being mature enough to ask. So I went looking for a family elsewhere. I think the misnomer is that people think that others join these groups because of ideology solely. Nobody's born a racist, a Nazi, you know, Islamic State supporter. they find their way because they're searching for identity, community, and purpose. And if we're talking about unstable, I think that they're hitting what I call potholes in their life's journey. And sometimes it could be mental illness, it could be poverty, could be even privilege that might keep us so separate from society that it makes us afraid. But in most cases, it is trauma that is somehow pushing people to the fringes where these narratives live.
So did you agree with that? It's about trauma and the potholes and less about the ideology?
Yeah, I mean, the way I have been thinking about this is that, you know, for so long we've thought about terrorism or extremism as if it's a tumor, a few bad cells that we can cut out of society and eradicate. But if you think of it, and it's hard to say this at this moment, but as a virus, you know, if you think of it as a virus instead that can infect people, you have to think about what are the vulnerabilities that people have to that virus. And there are many vulnerabilities. And one might be mental illness, but also a sense of isolation, lack of belonging, a desire for purpose, a desire to enact meaning in their life.
So when I hear you describe that, when I hear you talk about potholes, on this show we've had a lot of discussion, sadly, about ISIL. We've done many shows and many panels. We've had people like Mark Sageman, former CIA guy on this show, Ali Soufan, former FBI guy. We've had Scott Atran, who studies quote-unquote jihadists. And they all say what you say about the quote-unquote jihadists. They say looking for purpose and meaning, you know, isolated, trauma. Again, am I wrong to draw parallels between people who are radicalized and join quote-unquote ISIS and join?
Absolutely not wrong. This is absolutely the parallel that we should be drawing. And actually, we can, I think, learn in many cases from what went wrong in terms of responding to vulnerable youth, in terms of ISIS and Islamist recruitment, for responding to vulnerable youth on this side, and, you know, on the kind of on the side of white supremacists. I think the mistake sometimes we make is by labeling, by pointing to mental illness when it's white men who are the shooters, you know, or the attackers, as being driven by mental illness, instead of realizing that
Muslims never get to be mentally ill. We're immune to mental illness.
Exactly.
Yeah, and let me be clear about the mental illness. It's the isolation, it's the bullying, it's the inability, in some cases, to have those intimate relationships that pushes people to the fringe. I mean, certainly there are millions of people with mental illness that never become.
I want to come back to the kind of parallel between the kind of Muslim white nationalist thing, but before I do, just very quickly, one thing we notice about a lot of these people, whether they're kind of a quote-unquote ISIL supporter or a neo-Nazi, is whenever you look into the background of these people, when the media starts going through their life, you find a kind of battered spouse or beaten up girlfriend or some history of domestic violence. Why does misogyny seem to be a streak or a factor here?
It's such an important question, and it's one of these things that we're just starting to disentangle. I feel like both the history of domestic violence and of broader misogyny, and then now this increasing awareness that the whole incel movement is a part of the white supremacist and far right spectrum, or at least has intersections with it in a way. And I think it's one of the reasons why we are not seeing interventions that address these issues of belonging, is because we have to also address issues of masculinity and what it means to be a man in this society, what it means to enact purpose. If you want to engage with heroism, how can we, you know, channel that heroic impulse into something more positive about rescuing people, humanitarian mission, let's say, instead of, you know, restoring your white civilization?
Would you?
Listen, I think we've taught generations of men not to feel, not to show emotion, to fit this certain mold of who they are. And I think that's a white male problem that's been put on white males too. So I think that we have a lot of work to do. The misogyny that exists, I think, is really due, in certain cases, to the uncertainty that exists in these people's lives. The fact that they're driven by ego, but that they are not equipped to really understand how to work with that.
So what do you
ego.
do about that?
Well, you know, I try and build their resilience, and I try and fill those potholes that I talked about.
First, you have to find them, right? You have to identify who these vulnerable individuals are.
Yeah, and they find me. I actually don't go out and find anybody, because if I had to do that, I would be so overwhelmed with the amount of people that I work with. I'm working with hundreds of people that reach out to me on a daily basis. I have somebody new reaching out to me every day.
There are some people who look at, not just you, but they look at some of the Muslim groups who are working with the British government or the American government in what's called the CVE field, the Countering Violent Extremism field. And they say, you know what, there's no proof that any of this stuff works. Where's the kind of empirical evidence that you can, quote unquote, de-radicalize someone? What do you say to them?
I would say it absolutely does work if the resources are there. And the resources just are not here right now in the United States. But I also think that certain CVE programs are making a mistake by thinking they can solve the ideology by tackling that specifically rather than the underlying potholes that are really detouring people there.
Do you think with the resources it can be done? Because in the field of kind of countering ISIL and Al-Qaeda, very mixed results and a lot of criticism of a lot of government-funded programs. Can you de-radicalize someone in that way, whether they're a quote-unquote jihadist or a neo-Nazi?
I think some of what we need is much earlier intervention and clearer outcomes for what we're looking for. So if you're looking at, an inoculation approach to a public health crisis, you're talking about 11-year-olds who need to be taught, how to avoid, how to respond to media disinformation or propaganda or white supremacist ideology when they encounter it in gaming, for example, which 23% of them do encounter, as we know from the statistics. So, when you're looking at how you prepare people before they even encounter this stuff online, then I think you can really easily develop measures that will show us whether they're effective.
So one thing I remember reading from Mark Sageman, who's written a lot about this and studied a lot of these guys and worked for the CIA, he said, look, at the end of the day, we've done all this research since 9/11, when this whole kind of terrorism, extremism industry kind of gets going. And yet after all these years and all these acts of violence, we still quite don't know what it is that sparks going from having the ideology and marching with the flags and saying horrible things to actually walking into 2 mosques and gunning down 51 people in cold blood.
Absolutely. I think the one thing we do know is that the more people you have moving into the extremist fringe, the more likely you're going to have someone at the far extremist fringe who's going to become violent. And so when we have more and more people accepting this in the mainstream, moving into it, being recruited, radicalized, exposed online, there is no way we're not going to see additional violence.
Cynthia, Christian, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you for joining me in the arena. And that's our show. Up Front will be back next week.